Hey, I'm Jacob Cooperman, and you were watching the MMA Conspiracy Hour with Todd Atkins and Miguel Iturrate. Todd has been involved in covering combat sports since the 1990s, and Miguel has match-made over 200 different events amongst various promotions worldwide. Please subscribe and be on the lookout for future episodes. As for me, you can check me out at Gloves Up on YouTube and Coop TV with 3 O's on Instagram. Thank you guys, and enjoy the episode.
All right, this is Todd Atkins, and I'm here with Miguel Iturrate. I know it's been a while. He's still getting some things set up in his new setup. And we're going to be doing another show today, and we're going to kind of cover the O'Malley-Merab fight. I know Miguel has some thoughts on this. And, before we start, we always say just subscribe to the channel. And if you want to check out our memberships, we got some 99-cent memberships you can check out. And Miguel, just kind of want to give your opening thoughts on Merab versus O'Malley.
Well, the whole sphere and stuff like that seems to be a little underwhelming. Obviously, we've talked about it a little bit before the show happened, and we thought that Dana was going to have a hard time delivering, the greatest show on earth kind of thing, like he promised, and I think it did work out that way. I'm not I know that they've nurtured O'Malley as a star, and he's obviously probably, excuse me, I have the hiccups here, the premier star in the lower weight classes right now, in terms of name recognition and things like that. And he seems to move the needle, but I just don't think that the Sphere show should have been headlined by 135 pounders. I think it's obviously the division is very talented. There's a lot of talent there. The guys are great and technical and things like that. Right? And O'Malley's, kind of been on a good run, with the belt. Now, obviously, he lost it, but he had held on to the belt. He had gotten a few wins where he'd already gotten to that point where, I don't think you can question that he was good anymore. I think when he came up and he was getting a lot of hype, people were, myself, one of them, wanted to wait and see a little more from him. But I think he's crossed that threshold. But I don't think that, I think that the effects in boxing that we've talked about many times, where the smaller weight classes don't really move the needle all that much. I think MMA is different, but I don't, O'Malley kind of came up after, like, the pay-per-view numbers, started to shift a little bit and things like that. And I'm not sure that he's a huge needle mover with the pay-per-view numbers and things. You've got the example of Aljamain kind of saying that when he fought him, the paycheck wasn't much different, wasn't, anything where, he was told the guy was a huge star, but they didn't really reap the benefits of it. So there you have it. The greatest show on earth that was not delivered. Again, no one's really calling Dana out on that much, but compared to the hype and the promise that was put into, after seeing the YouTube show and what he wanted to do and this and that, I don't think that, it was a good show. And obviously the building is very impressive, but I don't think that they've got that big show. I think the other thing to talk about here is, if O'Malley does move the needle, and you're talking about, a champion and an American star, and a guy who they've grown up from the very beginning, having now a Russian, Dagestani, or whatever, ethnicity grab the belt.
Georgian, yeah.
Okay, becomes, former Soviet Union guy. well, we know, they took, Tapura is also Georgian background and stuff like that. So um, I think you're running into that situation where there's a lot of people that say, we've heard it for a long time. We've heard, Mark Schultz back in the old days, the Olympic wrestler Daniel Cormier, also. These guys have been talking about how the Russians are coming to this sport for a long time, and I think here now you've got a situation where I question a little bit about how much O'Malley. Like I don't think like O'Malley. I've heard him say, and he carries himself like a star. I mean, he's learned, but I've heard him say that he's a bigger star than Conor McGregor, and that's just you know not really realistic. I don't think he's as big a star as John Jones either, or anything like that. Um, and But if he did move the needle, you just took a big step back, having another foreign fighter win the belt, limited English. I mean, they're a worldwide company, but the American fighters, um, seem to be taking a step back to some of these other guys from Eastern Europe now. And it's starting to show itself in several weight classes. So we'll see how they get out of that. And to be honest with you, I do not think O'Malley had his best performance. But based on what he's already done, I think he might be somebody that you could put into a rematch right away for the belt. We'll see if that's the way it goes. But we'll see. He's not going to have an easy time beating that guy. But like I said, he's. I think he's gotten to the point where he may deserve the rematch right away. And he's gotten to the point where hopefully he knows what he's got to do and what improvements he has to make, and he's able to do it. But this was not his best performance. I think Shevchenko in the co-main, another Eastern European, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, starting to dominate everywhere, and she got her rematch and she got her belt back. And I guess Grasso beating the Mexican girl, again with the Noche theme and things like that, it didn't go their way. So yeah, I think presentation wise, they were a little all over the place, and it wasn't a real tight show, not what Dana promised. So, but overall, enjoyable. O'Malley, I think, has had better performances though. So I don't think everybody had their A games ready here, including Dan.
But I think from our era, and I'll credit Jimmy Smith with this because I saw him talk about this. A lot of the shows that we watched had a lot of the bells and whistles, especially in Japan. So even though it wasn't in a sphere type arena, or a venue, we had seen a lot of that, like the Dynamite 2002 show that I went to at Yoyogi Stadium. I think still was light years better than the sphere. Maybe not from the visual technology standpoint, but from being in the stadium, 92,000 people. They had a lot of, crazy visuals there too, huge screens and all that. And the card was way better, and I think that was the important part. But I do think, the visuals were cool that they had and stuff. But it's a lot to live up to when you're going to say you're putting on the greatest mixed martial art event in history or combat sports event in history. And I don't think it was that, but I think, yeah, the visuals were good. The visuals were
Yeah,
pretty
I think when you look back at the and everything, the greatest combat sports show in history, it wasn't even the best show in that city on that day. Because you had Canelo there. Canelo, um, just moves the needle more than Grasso. Canelo is, pretty much the biggest star in boxing at this point. I mean, I guess you could throw Anthony Joshua, Tyson Fury into that hat too. But in the States, with the Mexican crowd on that day, Canelo's pretty much ready, to outsell anyone in the pay-per-view market. I don't think the U.S. was ready to compete with Canelo. The UFC rather was ready to compete with Canelo on that day. So yeah, I think in that respect, everything Dana said really fell short.
I
Again,
think
when
the
you
Sphere
consider,
was a better venue, though, for sure. The visualization of it and all that.
yeah, yeah, you know, it's at the end of the day, if you're a fight fan, that it's one of the reasons why, you know, especially back in the early days, like Shudo appealed to me and things like that. At the end of the day, if you're a fight fan, you know, videos and technology and things like that will only get you so far. You know
Right.
what I mean? And to be honest with you know, the UFC doesn't have to worry about budget, but you know, I bet you a lot of the fighters would have said, "Hey, you know, I think actually it made the news, and they've gotten away with it a couple of times recently, where Dana was feeling a little generous and he gave extra bonuses out or bumped the amount of the bonus up and stuff. And I think you know because of the nature of the hype behind this show, some of the fighters said, "Hey, let's get bigger bonuses, right?" And
Yeah.
Dana shut that down.
Yep.
You know, and I don't. I think to a single man, everybody on the roster would have preferred an extra, you know, I don't
Yep.
know, whatever the number is, 50K instead of you know lighting up the building like that.
Hmm.
And again, you know, we suspected that the UFC was going to have a, you know an expensive day there because it's a new building. You know, it was obviously it's not a cheap building to build or create, and they've set expectations, and then you know preparing it for a combat sports show. Um, you know, probably also took a certain amount of investment, both by the owners and by the UFC, to set it up and do that because it's not a venue that was specifically made for combat sports. So yeah, I think it's nice, and the fighters have a great memory on what you know they did. They took part in one of the bigger shows and et cetera, et cetera. Everybody likes to add good stuff like that to their resume, but I think to a single man, they would have all preferred to get $30,000 extra and you know put a little bit less of a spin on the technology and stuff like that. But you know, Dana wanted to deliver something big, and so the money was going to be spent on other things.
Well, he may not have had a choice. We went back to, like I said, where MGM had gave the date away, and that was probably the only venue he could have got in Vegas at that time.
Yeah, yeah, and they like to do Vegas on these on Mexican holiday. You know, um, they could have turned around and tried to get Dallas Cowboy Stadium. They, you know, where they've done venues before. There's no reason if you're especially going to go with a Mexican theme. You know, something in Texas might have been just as appealing. Something in Los Angeles might have just been as appealing.
Yeah.
Um, Instead of blowing the big money. But I think Dana, you know, Dana's a guy that, like I say, he's been on a run for 20 years. There's nobody that tells him what to do, really, you know? So once he got the idea after the U2 show that he wanted to be in that venue and he wanted to do something in that venue, I don't think there's anybody with the power enough to say, hey, maybe this isn't that smart.
I still don't know if that U2 story is true. I think he knew he had to get that venue because they had already given his date away, so he started building up this story of I saw U2 and I'm obsessed with the Sphere because remember he changed the story. We talked about that.
Yep.
As the event was drawing closer, he said, "Oh, I had to do the Sphere because MGM gave my date away."
Like I said, if they had done, I don't think anybody would have batted an eye if they had done, you know, the Cowboy Stadium or, you know, the even the Forum in LA or, you know, a major venue. You don't have to be in Vegas, you know, um, but it is what it is, you know. Two belts switch hands. That's noticeable, and they both went the Russian fighters, which I think um, is going to be problematic for them. You know, we've got shows coming up in the Middle East again, and they're bringing. You know, I think Kamzat is set to be on those shows and things like that. And there are going to be certain guys that at some point especially if the war continues to grind on over there, the obtaining visas and things like that is going to become harder and harder. It's going to become more and more political. And, the American roster is sort of, coming in second there. And I think that might be a longer term problem.
Now let's talk a little bit about the fight because I had made some comments on various videos and stuff. I feel like for us, this fight has happened hundreds of times since UFC 1. And it's usually if the O'Malley, the striker in this case, doesn't land something in these small periods of time where he's on his feet, he's going to get beat handily. And that's pretty much what we saw. Wasn't really surprised by the outcome. That's usually the outcome. I'd say 90% of the time that's the outcome when you have these elite wrestler versus striker matchup,
Yeah, like I said, O'Malley didn't have his best day. O'Malley, Aljamain's a good wrestler. He's gotten through. He got himself to the belt and to the point where he defended the belt on a few occasions. He already surpassed, that stigma of just being a striker. I think he had proven himself there. But I do think that you're right, that there is a little bit of a problem still with guys like these Eastern European guys, where I think also what you don't realize is that I think their motor runs high. I think that they can come in and give a 5-round effort like that. I think they go home and they just, with a normal UFC paycheck, they can live pretty well over there. And I don't think, you've got exceptions. Obviously, Khabib is a big star, and but yeah, I don't think the guy I think O'Malley drinks up also being the star and being the guy with the pink hair and being the guy that moves the needle, and tries to cross over and things like that. And I don't think any real, like his opponent here, Marab, was. I don't think any of that moves him. I think what he said was, "I'm going in there to win the belt." And I think, it comes with less distractions and it comes with a different type of work ethic.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I think he outworked O'Malley.
Yeah, and it's for me, it's kind of frustrating to see even the newer fans kind of making the same kind of complaints that some of the older fans did, that they don't like to see this kind of style. But you can win by decision in the UFC. It's a method of winning. It's one of them. You don't have to finish your opponent.
Yeah, the thing is, at some point, because of the elite, like Khabib, it would, Khabib also in his day sometimes had that little bit of a boring reputation. Sometimes had that, maybe not as crisp a finisher as you would like. Although, obviously he's considered one of the all-time greats because he's an elite guy and things. But it comes down to nurturing a good roster and having options. And the Eastern European guys with their work ethic, with the fact that they probably work cheap, the fact that they also, like Khabib wasn't, Khabib, like I said, once you cross over into being a big star, you're a big star and stuff like that. But Khabib didn't come with an awful lot of baggage. Not like Conor, starting problems and throwing things, at buses and things like that. Khabib was a guy who, if you left him alone, he would show up, do his job, and go home. You know what I mean? And I think that a lot of these guys are low maintenance, and they just want to do their job. And I think that sometimes the media in the States and the media and for example, when you've got Hunter and some of the other guys, telling people, well, you can't get a title shot until you've got your Instagram up to a certain number and things like that. I don't think that those are particularly forward-thinking, or thinking over a large time period over how to handle the roster. I think what they're trying to do is obviously every show they want to maximize and get money in there and this, that, the other things. And again, the Russians, by their nature, it's a large country with a large population. In Dagestan and Chechnya and some of the other places where some of these guys come from, even Georgia, they're smaller. But again, it goes back to me, even the Kung Lee effect. When we got Kung Lee as being one of their headliners many years ago, again, here's the question is before Kung Lee was on the roster, did the UFC get aired in Vietnam? Vietnam's a pretty big, populous country. And if it did get aired, by virtue of having Kung Lee on the roster, did all of a sudden the whole TV deal change? More money, more involvement, So now you've got Georgia, 2 champions there. I'm sure that they've got the attention of most of the country. You know what I mean? It's not like where the States, it's 600,000 pay-per-views or whatever. I think that in those potential places, you're going to get major, major attention. So I think that kind of thing takes care of itself with these Eastern European guys, and that they just come in, do their job. They're not too worried, They have Instagram, they do that. Like, Khabib's got tons of followers now and stuff, But I don't know that all the other guys are that dedicated to it. Not like the American guys are. Not like O'Malley, who really puts a lot of stock into that part of the business, and that's because he's been told it's important. And I'm not sure that, like I said, I'm not sure that at the end of the day, 5 years from now, that won't have some type of effect on the company, the roster, And O'Malley's, he's a good personality. I don't feel like he jumps off the page like a John Jones or a McGregor or anyone like that. I think he's a little more low key, and that Instagram superstar stuff isn't for everybody, and by forcing people to do that, maybe it takes away from their preparation. Maybe, I think the effects are still up in the air there, and I'm not sure that's a terrific way to do it, except for, since we're coming up on the lawsuit now, and we'll probably be talking about that next month.
Yeah.
What the UFC does is, by telling people, hey, you got to move the needle, Instagram and YouTube followers and, all that stuff. Now you get yourself to the point where you have a couple of, maybe 1 million or 2 followers, or, 800,000 followers and stuff like that. Guess what? That's an extra check that you're getting that the UFC doesn't have to pay for. The UFC doesn't have to compensate you further because you're actually making money. I could buy a house, I could buy a car with my YouTube money. And in a way, I think that is the secret reason why they forced that to be one of the prerequisites for people with with title aspirations, or Americans with title aspirations, is that, well, we're not going to pay you $1 million contract, but if you're doing the right things, you get your paycheck, you get your bonus from Venom, and you get, maybe a fight bonus and things like that. Plus, you get a monthly Instagram check. You're getting a monthly check from, whatever social media outlets, TikTok. I don't know, which ones are the ones that people use. Instagram seems to be one of the bigger ones for MMA. But yeah, I think that the real secret there is, instead of having to up the paychecks or anything like that, they help push the Instagram pages, and it just becomes another supplemental check. The fighter doesn't need to have another job then. They're out there doing videos and social media and things like that. There's no doubt that the Diaz brothers, Masvidal, McGregor, guys like that, they're taking home, and O'Malley's probably gotten to that level, whereas they're probably taking home a decent monthly check from their social media. But I think that's one of the secret underlying reasons why the UFC forces that on people is because it means that they have their compensation can be less, but the overall compensation for the fighter is going up and up. And they don't have to be the ones paying it. Therefore they keep more of the money.
They also have to do a little bit less promotion if they can get the fighters to promote themselves.
Oh yeah, yeah. And who knows? I'm sure that they're cleverly handling, paying as little as possible. But I do think that their media machine, comes with a lot of things like that where, once a fighter's on the UFC roster, they can put it out there and stuff like that. The guy, in a couple of weeks, couple of months, signs up 100,000 followers. All that kind of grows organically. The UFC helps with that. But like I said, yeah, I'm sure that it's actually all a mechanism so that they don't have to come out of pocket for all the compensation for the fighters.
Right. Now,
it's very, very interesting.
Tell me what you thought of Merab's performance.
Like I said, he comes with a high motor. I think that what you saw there is that was not going to be denied. I think he sees himself. I think that kind of motivation, that Eastern European style of thinking, like some of these guys have had family members in wars and things like that. So MMA is a tough sport. Don't get me wrong, but I do think they think of it as a walk in the park compared to what they could be doing. And I don't think, in Georgia with the economy there and things like that, I don't think owning a gym or being a wrestler for the state where you're representing the country is nearly as lucrative as what they're already making. So I think you've got a little bit of a problem there because of the disparities in the differences in the rosters. You know what I mean? So I think this guy's going to be tough for O'Malley to rematch and win again. He might be able to do it. He might be able to do it. And obviously O'Malley with his striking and stuff will always have the chance of landing the blow that changes the fight. But this guy's younger. You used to get that kind of thing with Randy Couture, where he'd come in, but Couture, like for example, with the Rico Rodriguez fight, where I believe he lost the belt, he was already older. He'd already maybe had a couple of knockouts here and there, but there was his style was such that he was forced to fight a perfect 5-round fight, in order to win. Go ahead and just, take the pace to somewhere where the guys can't keep up and just keep cruising from there. And I think, like I said, I think that's going to be, what these guys' bread and butter is. What Khabib did. It was, again, some finishes will come, but again, here you and again with fighting and the greatest show on earth and all that stuff. At the end of the day, you got 2 decisions in the title matches, 2 5-round fights at the end, and I don't think that's actually the perfect script for what they want. I think that they would have liked to have seen a finish, but I think the more you start relying on some of the Eastern European guys, that you may see the finishing, especially maybe submission finishes, drop off a little bit. I think that, you get them content to keep the pace going. The guy isn't going to catch me. I'm up 4 rounds to nothing. I'm not going to change anything in round 5 and go for a finish. And, but like I said, I don't think it's a perfect script. So I think we've touched upon a couple of different things where, overall the UFC may be down a path that they made for a bed they made for themselves with forcing fighters to be Instagram stars if they're Americans and signing a lot of Eastern European guys that, like I said, like we've heard for a long time the Russians are coming in this sport. You know what I mean? That's been a 20 something years of hearing that when they come and our elite guys, like Daniel Cormier is a big example of it. That Daniel Cormier said that one of the guys from Russia beat him. If he had ever done MMA, you would never have heard of him. You wouldn't have heard of John Jones. You wouldn't have heard of any of these guys because the guy was just an animal. You know what I mean? So yeah, and again, so the guys, I think overall are a low maintenance part of the roster. You know, I don't even Khabib. You know, and Khabib made millions. You know, he's a guy with a ton of money, right? But even Khabib, I think Dana mentioned, I give him a number and the fight's done. We're set. Contract signed. You know, the guy doesn't negotiate. He doesn't come back and say, no, I need more money or anything like that. And I think that's another point where, okay, if really, and we know the UFC is a money-making machine, but if that's having an effect, then yeah, they really do need to swing over and diversify the roster a little bit. Maybe even actually spend some money, you know, developing other areas of the world, you know. We'll see. They're supposed to be doing a show in South Africa. I think Africa could very well be a hotbed for athletes in this nature, you know, in the future. But I think you need to invest in making sure that there are shows there, making sure that there are gyms there, the UFC training centers and things like that, in order to make sure that you're nurturing that area of the roster. You know, again, all they seem to do, especially like, for example, in Latin America, you know, they sign up guys and because it's economic for them. You know, they sign 3-0, 4-0 guys, just smaller contracts, you know, for the Contender Series or for whatever, and let the guys build themselves up and see how it goes. But again, at the bottom line, we know they make a fortune, but is that really what's best for the sport all the way through? Because it looks like, you know, you got Topuria, you got Marab, you've got Shevchenko, you know, still, you know, kind of Shevchenko pulled off a good win because, you know, he hadn't been able to beat Grasso, you know, in the past there. And, you know, sometimes, you know, once you've lost a belt, it really is hard, you know, to get back to it. You know, especially to be, you know, sometimes you might not even get the shot to get, you know, Sean O'Malley's still, not Sean O'Malley, Strickland, still waiting for his return match, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But I think, yeah, I think you're seeing that roster dominance that we've talked about for a long time starting to show itself. And I'm not sure, like I said, except for the fact that they make more money, you know, I'm not sure it's long-term good for the sport.
Yeah, and you got Islam, who's a champion. You got Bilal Muhammad, who, you know, already is holding a title. You got Shavkat, who's out there. He's probably going to fight Bilal next. You got, you know, Hamzat, who's going to fight. Who's he fighting? Robert Whitaker. Yeah, Whitaker. It wouldn't surprise me if he won that fight, if he got a title shot. So, yeah, you're talking about the UFC roster could be overrun in the next 6 months, 6 to 12 months, you know?
Yeah, and, you know, what would they do if a big money Russian said, you know, let's start a big league over here, you know, sink some real money into it, and, you know, just pluck all the guys. What are they going to do? Sue in Russia? You know, Kamzat's got a contract with us. He can't fight over there. You know, they find themselves absorbing a lot of damage, you know, if something like that were to happen. And, you know, as world politics get uglier and uglier, somebody's going to have a thought. You know, Khabib, at the end of the day, he did his Eagle FC thing for a little while, but that's not Fertitta money. I mean, Khabib's got his money and you know, but it's not Endeavor money. And should a Russian big money guy like that step in, that would be what it would take for them to say, look, we want to be a show on the level of the UFC. And then I think the UFC would find themselves in trouble looking at how they retain those athletes from doing a show, over there where they're going to be taken care of, compensated, et cetera, differently. And I think that's one risk you run because, hey, the Russians have always competed, kind of ruthlessly. So if somebody thinks, look, we've got most of the UFC fighters are Russian, why don't we just do our own show? And again, you're talking about a country with a lot of billionaires, and that's what it would take.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see how they navigate these waters.
Yeah. It's the only thing they could do is try not to sign as many of them, but if they want to say they're the best fighting organization in the world, they have to sign guys like that.
Yeah, and the thing is like we said, the Russians are coming. What was the name of the guy that looked like Abraham Lincoln that retired?
Oh, it's a beat.
Zabit. Yeah. He just left. He quit.
Mm-hmm.
What would he be doing on the roster right now? He'd probably be holding one of the belts too, or at least being in the top level for that. If I'm not mistaken, I think ONE FC has a pretty devastating Russian heavyweight also on the roster. A guy who, you've got Pavlovich, you've got a couple of Russian guys on the UFC roster up there, but they may not be the best guys in the world. The best guys from those countries may be in other organizations or retired or not taking part in that anymore. So it is very interesting, but I think that speaks to the depth of what could be coming.
Yeah. It's going to be interesting to see how they try to navigate it.
Yep, for sure. And like you said, with Kamzat potentially in the title picture at 185, Bilal now has a belt, and you've got obviously Islam, Shevchenko, Topuria, now Merab. It's starting to be unbalanced already, and I think that should be something that worries them. And the thing is you got to get guys that'll beat them. And who's the next? You said who's the next title fight for Merab? Gee, another Russian?
Umar,
is that really? Yeah, is that really who has the best shot at beating him? Because if that's the case, then your roster's already unbalanced.
Mm-hmm. Well, we saw this before in the sport. Bjorn Rebney, he recruited a lot of these kind of guys before the UFC ever did, and most of his champions were from Eastern Europe.
Yeah, I think that there has been a lot of development, though, because I do think that there was I think we're getting more elite guys now, like better athletes from when they were younger. The programs of sports, especially combat sports over there, are very detailed. I could bring you up the example of Vladimir Matyushenko, who's a heavyweight and a light heavyweight that fought on the UFC, and he defected. He came over to the United States to compete, and defected, and that's how we got him. With the Raw team and Rico Chiapparelli and those guys that got to work with him, and we saw him. He was pretty elite. But if you go back, and I've gotten a chance to interview him, once he showed himself to be an elite wrestler, he got taken out of his house and sent to an academy where wrestling became part of his curriculum and stuff like that. And obviously, the way they reward you and do things, and I'm sure that the country's changed a little bit with no communism and stuff, but what would happen there is hey, you're an elite wrestler. Hey, guess what? Your parents are going to get a little bit better apartment.
Yeah.
You're going to get taken care of in many ways, and there's incentivized to go and do that. And I think that when you look back at the Bellator roster from the Red Meat days, I don't think they had tapped the absolute elite yet. Not like you're seeing now in almost every weight class, et cetera, et cetera.
No, they did. They had Minikoff was their heavyweight champion. Storm Shlemenko was their light heavyweight champion. They had this guy Shamalat Shamalayev, who was the champion. They had Hasbulayev, who trains at Eagles MMA, was a champion. They had like 4 or 5 guys that were all champions at one time.
I think you could argue, I booked Shlemenko a lot, and Shlemenko never made the UFC. And I think that's what you had there was guys that were not quite on that level of now these guys that are coming all belong in the UFC, and it's pretty clear. Shlemenko, they had Korokov too. I don't know if he made the title picture, but he was definitely a contender at 170. They had good fighters. Yeah. I don't think you're seeing across the board. And I do think also in the early days, you have to remember that Bellator actually started out on ESPN Latino and had a heavily Latin influence. Masvidal, Alvarez. Alvarez doesn't really speak Spanish. But hey, his last name's a Latino, and oddly enough, Toby Amada speaks fluent Spanish. So they were actively looking to nurture the Spanish market as well. It took them a while to swing over and get the Russians, and I think that there also what happened is you wound up where, like I said, I think the guys are much lower maintenance. I think they work cheaper. And I think back then they were also looking, to budget the show and get themselves, to the UFC's level. And one of the reasons you do that is, one of the ways you do that is by keeping yourself within the budget. So I don't know that you could compare the elite Bellator guys to the guys that we're seeing now. I think they may have been a notch below. Like I said,
right. I agree with that, but the effect on the roster it was similar. Yeah.
You started to see the dominance and stuff, and again, Minikoff was pretty good, but again, now a lot of those guys. What's the name of the really tall guy?
Volkov, who's in the UFC still. He was in Bellator.
But here's the thing: is Volkov is a guy who I think you could make the argument, and Volkov's a guy with 50 fights, right? He's put in a ton of work already. But I think when he started, he wasn't at the level he's in now. I think you could see that also in his body, where he was kind of a tall, skinny guy at the very beginning. And now he's filled out, and he's a lot more dangerous. And he's on the UFC roster, to stay for. He's got a job, But I think, like I said, I think he's improved to get to the UFC. I don't think he would have lasted on the UFC roster fighting the way he did when he was with Bellator.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see how they try to manage that, because it may be unmanageable.
Yeah, again, if the emphasis is always going to be on making money, then they may ignore it. But like I said, there comes a level where, I've been to Russia many times. I've done actual shows in Russia several times, If somebody is convinced to put the money in to compete with the UFC at a Russian level on a Russian show, and they go in all in kind of thing, the UFC should be worried, because they're not to be messed with. They're not people who are going to take it lightly. Like I think we've seen guys, Vadim Finkelstein, who was Fedor's manager. He did the M1 shows for a while. I was backed by a Russian guy that in retrospect, didn't really use his own money for the show. He had a loan from people, and all that stuff's in the lawsuit that you can read out there. Interesting stuff, but those guys, I think, are not a danger to the UFC. But if a guy who's a billionaire says, "Okay, I want to do this," and you'd have to be a businessman too. Like I think, for example, money wise, Kadyrov could do it. Yeah, but he's running a country, so I don't think he'd be able to be completely dedicated or be that much of a threat. But I think if somebody decides over there to go all in on a Russian show, we know they've got the roster, we know they've got the talent, and all they would need is the dedication and the money. And again, then what would the UFC be facing? Potentially, they would have fighters from Russia, Chechnya, Georgia. We haven't even tapped Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan just yet, but those guys are coming too. You know what I mean? And again, it takes some dedication and time. The UFC has their, training centers and things like that they can spring up, and that by virtue of nature, by virtue of them popping up, it lifts the level in an area. So what would happen, if this forward-thinking Russian show that is right now just a figment of my imagination, but like I said, if world politics continues to get worse, if you look at it, every year Iranians all medal in wrestling. Also, they have elite wrestling. We saw, I think, in the early days of the UFC, a guy named Reza Nasri, who was an Olympic level wrestler from there, and he got cremated, but he came in as a straight wrestler wearing a singlet, shoes, and he ran into Brian Johnson.
Kamal Shalarus was a good one. He was in WEC, and he was from Iran.
Yeah, and I think that, again, now you're talking about how do you, if a guy's going to put up a show and they're going to have, say, a 400-man roster, you got to fill it with high-level talent. And there are still places where the UFC has not tapped that talent. So we'll see. I remember Kareem Barklov, who was an Uzbek. He competed in ADCC. He had the controversial match in Kuwait where they did that one-time show, and he got points taken away, but he beat up Dave Manet, who was a UFC champion, but lost the match because he had 2 points deducted. And, man, that guy checks off all the boxes that we've been talking about as far as hunger, gratefulness, because what he's doing isn't even a threat to him. These guys are talking about families that went to war and they don't live very great, unless something happens. So I do think that the UFC is probably going to ignore the problem for as long as it stays the same. But I would be on the lookout for it, because if one day someone steps in with a serious show from Eastern Europe with serious money, that could lead to some watershed changes for the UFC. One has proven to not be that company. But one has never really. One has a different structure in that they like to get champions and they like to get guys who compete in other modalities. They do grappling, they do kickboxing. They like to get undefeated guys, and just have a different. They haven't actively gone after the UFC and said, "We're going to take your." Maybe at one point with guys like Brandon Vera and a few guys that went over there, Demetrius and things like that. But it hasn't been a wholesale where a Russian billionaire steps in and says, every guy on the UFC roster, come, you're with us now. And again, how do those lawsuits play out? Where do you sue? You know, you got a contract with a Russian fighter that should be exclusive, but now the guy has been offered, bigger money to stay home and fight in Russia on a show on TV or pay-per-view or whatever type of thing there is there. What type of legal options does the UFC actually have except for letting him go?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I'd be on the lookout for that. I'm not saying Mystic Miguel it's definitely going to happen, but I do think there's a little bit of a risk there. I mean, you're talking about Russia and world politics also becoming involved, but Russia as a major economy, and they talk about the oligarchs there and stuff like that. They do, I've seen so many things when we went to Russia. I met a guy that had 7 Lamborghinis, one for each day of the week. They do things for the show as well, for ostentatiousness, if that's the way it goes. So if somebody gets a hair up their ass about competing with the UFC or about why is the UFC making so much money, we can make the same, or similar money here, and we've got, all the athletes, all their champions. That like I said, that could change the landscape of the sport.
Right. Yeah. It'd be interesting to see. What projects do you have going on? Are you going to start getting the collector back up?
Yeah, I do. I do have to get a couple of things in life settled. I've switched jobs, and I'm going to be trying to do some interpreting to Spanish, and it does take a little more dedication and time. Has to do with a lot of medical interpretations and things like that. And I mean, I speak Spanish really without a problem, but I don't know, medical terms, not medication names and things like that. So it's been a lot of having to prepare to take that kind of thing. So I'm going to probably stay off that page till October. So give me another week or so. And then once we've gotten that all up and running and I feel more comfortable, we'll be back into it. I've been promising a couple of interviews. I can tell you that the old AFC champion has his belt in his hands. We had a replica made for him. He paid for it himself. He was obviously, was just wanted the belt. They never had been able to hold on to it. And I told him, once you have the belt, we're going to do your interview. So that's going to be the first one off the bat here in October.
Yeah. Sounds cool, man. And, it's always great to talk to you and have another episode in the books for us.
No, for sure. Thank you for not forgetting about me. I have been a little bit out of touch, but I do enjoy the discussions, obviously. And, the sport is heading into a very interesting time. A couple of the things that we speculated about in this show, should they happen, would make things interesting. And at the end of the day, we've got the lawsuit coming up next month.
What about Dana White, the boxing? You want to say something about that?
At this point, he's gonna have to. It's gonna have to be more in talk. I got to see some shows. I got to see multiple shows. Like I remember when ONE FC came out, and they had some hype, and obviously ONE FC has a big money backer and things like that. But my saying to them was, all right, let's see you do 20 shows. So you've done at least a couple of dozen shows. Then all you would be doing is a drive-by on the sport. Now obviously I was wrong, and they've been dedicated enough that they've done hundreds of shows, and they're a big established company. Dana will have to go with boxing with more than one show, more than a couple of shows, dedicate himself. And I don't know. I mean, he's a guy with bottomless energy, right? But I don't know if it's worth it. So we'll see. We'll see how it all goes. I don't have a lot of details as to how all that came about, but he's been talking about boxing for a long time. If I remember correctly, I think when Anthony Joshua was the big hot name in boxing, he was undefeated, and I think he's contemplated making $1 million offer or $1 billion offer actually to him. But again, it's not just about having one guy or $1 billion and things like that. It's about putting together a body of work. So you sign Joshua. Who's Joshua going to fight? Who's Joshua going to fight in the second fight for you? 7 shows later, is Joshua your only star, or have you gotten other guys? Remember, we've had a lot of attempts, and none of them were convincing. Another big attempt at taking over boxing was done by DAZN. If you remember DAZN, and they came out with a $300 million contract for Oscar De La Hoya and Alvarez and Canelo, and they had no follow up. To the point where so it's like, they got Canelo. It's a building process. You can't you're not going to do or get the attention if you just do one show. So Dana is going to have to show me, and I'm not sure that's 100% worth it for him. He's close to a billionaire now, and the amount of work that you would have to do, to be quite honest, I think, for example, not following through on this UFC Noche show and not delivering exactly what it is he said he would. I think I think the amount of energy it's going to take to actually go into boxing and become a player. I guess he could buy Top Rank. Bob Arum is still out there living, but it's hard to say that that's going to be going on 5 or 10 years from now. As far as I know, I'm not sure. Bob is a Harvard lawyer that has always kind of, in Dana's style, like to micromanage and run his own thing. I'm not. Maybe it's just ignorance. I'm not familiar that he has a son or an heir apparent to take over the company. So maybe that company, and that would be a good head start. That would be a good head start towards what I'm saying, and that is you kind of become an instant player. But you're talking about buying a company that has, Muhammad Ali's fights in your library. Has all the Sugar Ray, Duran, Hearns, all those fights are on that roster, in that library. So that would be acceleration of the process I'm talking about. So there are some ways it could be done, but like I said, I don't know that it's going to be worth his time at the end of the day.
What are you looking for in your house?
I'm actually pacing around and doing a little cleaning. I found a couple of nasty things going on that I wasn't sure of. So
I figure
I'm doing
people
some
be
cleaning.
wondering that you're walking around so much.
Yeah, no problem. But it's all good. Oh, whew. All right, brother.
Yeah, that was some great stuff as always. And definitely look forward to getting back on track here in the future.
Yep, and let's focus, because here in the next couple of weeks, it won't be long now, we will have the UFC's lawsuit back front and center. And that will definitely be something to talk about.
Indeed.
All right, brother. See you soon.
As always, people, we appreciate you checking out the episodes. Check out MMA Collector 74. It'll be back in October. And as always, till next time, take care.